Howdy y'all, I'm Anna with Always Right, and in today's AuthorTube video, I'm going to be going over 10 stereotypes for neighbors that you can use in your book. Now, when I say neighbors, I mean like people that live in houses next door to each other or in the same neighborhood. A lot of these stereotypes would probably work well for like apartment neighbors, but not all of them will. And my experience comes from house neighbors, not like apartment neighbors. Now that we have a ground level, let's get started. The first stereotype for the neighbor is the nosy neighbor. The nosy neighbor is the most common neighbor you will find on syndicated television. The nosy neighbor was especially popular in ye olde television shows like I Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched. If I remember correctly, both of those shows had very nosy neighbors. So you may think you understand nosy neighbors. I have two nosy neighbors, immediate nosy neighbors. An example of one of my nosy neighbors is that anytime I'm outside doing something like gardening, or I'm out there talking to a friend or some family in my front yard, my nosy neighbor across the street will conveniently decide that that point in time is the best point in time to be out gardening and keeping an eye on. I am not loud, I'm not rambunctious at all. I'm pretty dull as a neighbor, but they still like to know what's going on. A nosy neighbor can make a world of difference, especially if this nosy neighbor is also like a gossip neighbor. That is not on my list, but it can be for the second video if y'all really like neighbor stereotypes. I don't know. With nosy neighbors, they can help move your plot along. They can give your characters insight into other characters, or if it's like a mystery or thriller, into kind of the victim or the event or whatever. Because nosy neighbors are nosy. They will peek through their blinds to see what their neighbor's doing. They'll go out in their backyard, kind of listen in to what you're doing in your backyard. They're just curious. They're bored. Typically, nosy neighbors are going to be like the housewives that are at home or house husbands that are at home and don't really have much else to do, so they will take interest in their fellow neighbors. Another kind of demographic that is often, and especially in my case, the nosy neighbor are like older people. So nosy neighbors like to take interest in what's going on in their neighborhood. And with today's technology, you can have your nosy neighbor posting on like a group on social media, like a neighborhood group on social media, asking about something, because that is also something that happens quite frequently. The next type of neighbor is the grumpy neighbor. Now, a grumpy neighbor is not a Karen neighbor. They are not going to go over there and like HOA you and be like, your yard needs to be 1.5 inches. It's 1 3/4 inches tall. That's not what a grumpy neighbor is. A grumpy neighbor is more like the old man that sits on his porch and just shakes his fist and goes, y'all kids, get off my lawn. That's the grumpy neighbor stereotype. And you guessed it, grumpy neighbors tend to be older individuals, retired individuals, but especially widows or widowers. And grumpy neighbors can also be nosy neighbors. Fun fact, grumpy neighbor can be a lot of things. But grumpy neighbors can add some comic relief. They can add a little bit of exposition, especially if they approach your main character and they're like, oh, well, this was on my lawn and just and it could throw a wrench in like your mystery or thriller, just like a fun fact. The next neighbor stereotype is the lonely neighbor. Oh, we love lonely neighbors. Lonely neighbors are going to usually be, you guessed it, older or retired, especially widows and widowers. Lonely neighbors are more likely to invite like door-to-door salesmen, like door-to-door religious missionaries, I guess they're called, into their house to have some tea, to have some coffee, to just talk. Lonely neighbors are very sweet. Usually they're usually not gonna be grumpy neighbors as well. Lonely neighbors can also be like stay-at-home house husbands, housewife, whatever, but usually they aren't as much so a lonely neighbor because they do have their family that does fulfill that social need. Lonely neighbors, if you can't tell, have a social need. And you can use that to your advantage in your book. The next stereotype for neighbors is the BFF neighbors. Now, this one's plural. BFF neighbors means that House A is friends, like the entire family, or at least like the parents, are friends with House C. Sometimes they may be friends with House B, but usually there's going to be one or two houses in between the BFF neighbors. A real life example of BFF neighbors, one of my good friends, him and his entire family are BFF neighbors with like House C, if you will. And they have a lot of shared interest. They do some holidays together, some vacations, some trips together. They will have dinner together pretty often. They both have pretty large families. I know for a fact that they are in similar organizations. They may not be in similar jobs, but they are in similar organizations, and their wives have bonded even, not to mention the kids. Now, with BFF neighbors, usually these neighbors are going to be neighbors that are going to have kids that are around the same age. BFF neighbors usually come in pairs. It's not very often you'll find BFF neighbors in triples. Like there won't be three families that are BFF neighbors. Usually BFF neighbors won't bond over negative experiences, they'll bond more on positive experiences. But BFF neighbors are a lot of fun, and they can add quite a bit of spice to your book, especially if your family is BFF neighbors with another family. The next stereotype for neighbors is rental neighbors. Now, when I wrote down rental neighbors, because there are some rental neighbors in my neighborhood and I do not like them that much, I realized very quickly that there are kind of two different types of rental neighbors. There are the rental neighbors that are like the families. I don't have any qualms with them. They're great, they're doing their life. And then there are the like too many people in one house rental neighbors, and those are the ones I do not like. We have two of those in my neighborhood, and I wish they would leave. But for both of them, they are usually there for the short term, or the people are going to be there for the short term. There is a difference between renting and leasing a house. Lease, you're guaranteed to be there for usually the minimum is 6 to 12 months. And renting is more of like a 3-month by 3-month basis, sometimes even just month by month basis. So with rental neighbors, this is general statements. Generally, rental neighbors aren't gonna take care of their house as much unless they're renting from the homeowner, like just a room, and the homeowner actively lives in the rental house. Then they may take some better care. But one trait of the too many people in a house rental neighbors is that they just are just too many damn cars around the house. There's too many, they're filling up the driveway, the garage is full, and then this road, the street in front of the house is gonna have cars piled up. Spoilers, homeowners don't like living by rental neighbors. They just really don't like it because the rental neighbors aren't invested in the house in the same sense that a homeowner neighbor is. Rental neighbors are a great chance to have some tension, to have some conflict in your book. More so on the too many people in a house rental neighbors. Usually family rental neighbors are just kind of there for temporary, such as like the father, the mother got a job in that area that's only supposed to last like 6-12 months and then they're gonna leave. Usually if it's a family rental, the kids won't get too attached to the neighborhood, they won't get too attached to the neighbor kids. Same with the parents, they will not get too involved, too invested into the neighborhood or the neighbors themselves. Yeah, so there's two different ways you can go with the rental neighbors. The next type of neighbors are the related neighbors. This is different from family neighbors that I will mention in a bit. But related neighbors is usually going to be like a brother and a brother live in the same neighborhood. They may not be immediate neighbors. They may not even be on the same street. They may be one street over, but they have a relation in the neighborhood. Notes for writing this. It is pretty often to have brother and brother live pretty close to each other and be related neighbors. Sister and sister is a little rarer, but usually siblings will try to stay together. Cousins aren't so keen or aren't so often living like as close together. They'll usually go out a little bit more. And then for parents and kids, the kids will try to move into a neighborhood close to their parents so that the parents can help them with the kids, can help house sit, XYZ, or so the kids can help house sit, help pet sit, whatever. However, if it is like a family is living here and their parents are looking to move, they won't always move into the same neighborhood as their children and their grandchildren, because they may not want to have their grandkids over every single day of the week. Actually, that just happened to a friend of mine. His dad was looking for a house. There was a house that's literally 2 houses down from him, or like 2 blocks away, or about 4 blocks away. And he went, I don't want to be that close. I don't want to be close enough that you can just bring the kids over and then just kapoof. So he bought a house that's 7 miles away. Just a little IRL tidbit. So with related neighbors, they usually move closer to each other, especially if they're brother and brother, brother, sister, sister, sister. They move close to each other so that their kids can play with their cousins. Usually they will try to have kids around the same time as each other, or by happenstance, they will have kids that are of similar ages. They don't have to be the exact age. So related neighbors are not like annoying, but if there are related neighbors, there usually will be kids running around the neighborhood. Just keep that in mind. Next up on the stereotypes is the working neighbor. Now, the working neighbor is the neighbor that basically doesn't do much with the community. They may hire people to take care of their yard, or at least to help with their yard, but the working neighbor is usually going to be out and about working and usually shopping and playing outside of the immediate area. Working neighbors are basically kind of just owning the house, using the house as a bedroom, like a hotel bedroom, and that's it. So working neighbors aren't bad neighbors. Usually they're just absent neighbors. And on the weekends, they may just go off with some friends, do stuff, but working neighbors usually don't have kids, or if they have kids, they have a spouse that is taking care of the kids. Okay, I'm back. It's a little later in the day. My battery died, I got distracted, the whole shebang, but let's get back into it. But as I was saying, if you're kind of struggling to write the working neighbor, think of the men that you would see in movies and stuff back in the 40s and 50s. Those are great examples of working neighbors. That's just one kind of easy to understand, easy to see example of a working neighbor. And now if you're writing a working neighbor into like a thriller, a suspense book, they could just be the clueless ones, or they could be the victims. They make very interesting victims and very fun kind of like hot second clueless ones. The next stereotype is the family neighbor. Now, the family neighbor is not the related neighbor. Like I mentioned earlier, it is something totally different. The family neighbor is the neighbors that have a family. So the family neighbor is that neighbor that has like kids' toys in the front, that'll have a rope swing in the front, that'll have a tire swing, that'll have some kind of swing in the front. They might have a trampoline in the back, they may have a pool, but family neighbors generally will have kids drawing on the driveways, they'll have kids just kind of running around in the front yard, and there will be kids usually screaming in the backyard. Family neighbors are very fun, they're very lively, and oh boy, grumpy neighbors don't like family neighbors that much. Family neighbors are the ones that are most likely to have a dog, because they do have the kid that can wear the dog out. If you're writing family neighbors, you don't have to go into like all the specifics on the kids, all that jazz. Just make some notes on what toys are in the front yard, if there's any chalk drawings, if there's any kind of art projects drawing or chilling out in the front porch area of the house. That's pretty common. Around Halloween, there's usually going to be fun painted pumpkins. Basically, just think of things that families do or things that they show people doing on Hallmark, and boom, family neighbor material. You're welcome. Family neighbors are a great opportunity to kind of give a reprieve from your story, to give like a breathing moment, to give kind of a debate point, if you will. They're great for filling it in. They're great for just kind of showing normal life, what your main character may be striving for or avoiding even. Family neighbors are fun and they're pretty common. You won't see as many family neighbors in the higher ends or in the lower socioeconomic ends of town. The lower ends because a lot of their toys may get stolen, there's some issues there, and the higher ends because they have people that clean up, like nannies that will take care of the toys, that will make sure the toys are inside. You will find quite a few family neighbors in small towns and in the suburbs, because that's one reason that people move out into the suburbs, is so they can have their family. So for the second to last stereotype for neighbors is the athletic neighbor. Now, the athletic neighbor can be like the grumpy neighbor, can be the nosy neighbor, can be like any kind of neighbor really. But the athletic neighbor is the neighbor that you see kind of running around, jogging, even just like power walking around the neighborhood. They're the athletic ones. They're doing stuff outside, which you may go, well, that's pretty normal. It's not. It's not very normal. Athletic neighbors, they tend to be anywhere from like teenagers all the way up to like the widowers and widows. So there's no specific age where it's like, this is the athletic one. I personally have quite a few, like 2 or 3 athletic older neighbors in my neighborhood that I see just kind of walking around, just kind of chilling. The athletic neighbor is going to be most likely walking around, kind of not patrolling the neighborhood, but they're gonna be doing their route, walking, biking, jogging. They're gonna be out and about. They're gonna be seeing the neighborhood. Also, the athletic neighbor may be into kind of walking parks that may be nearby. So if you have like a murder and you have an athletic neighbor, you can bring in some points where it's like, oh, well, I noticed on my jog that he was acting a little funny and stuff like that. Side note, athletic neighbors generally will have kind of an athletic partner with them, such as like a dog. I personally know that one of my parents' neighbors is an athletic neighbor. He walks around a lot, he jogs, he bikes, he does like a lot of athletic kind of things, sports talk, yeah. And he has a golden doodle that he takes around with him that can run beside him when he's on his bike, that will kind of jog with him. And yeah, he loves that dog, and that dog is just a really cute sweetheart. Yeah, but athletic neighbors are a great opportunity for kind of some exposition, some kind of like hint, ooh, kind of like a point that your character might not have found out otherwise. And the last stereotype for neighbors on this video is the shut-in neighbor. I am a shut-in neighbor pretty much, but shut-in neighbors are generally very reserved, very kind of keep to themselves neighbor. They're not going to be like the lonely neighbors, where the lonely neighbors will be like, oh yeah, come on in, tell me about your windows that you're wanting to sell, No, the shut-in neighbor is going to be like, I'm not interested, I don't want to open the door for you, bye. Shut-in neighbors are great to kind of point some red herrings at them and be like, wait a minute, what was Mr. George doing on this day? Because no one saw him. What's his alibi? It's like, bitch, he was eating like Tostitos and sitting on the couch watching CSI. I don't know. If you're trying to figure out how to write a shut-in neighbor and you're a little more outgoing, you don't like being stuck in your house for that long, just think of like the days that you binge watch a show on Netflix and how you had the lazies that day, the lazies. That's kind of what shut-ins do. Doesn't mean that they're not outside, period. It's just that most of the other neighbors don't know when the shut-in neighbor is in their home. The shut-in neighbor doesn't have to be the grumpy neighbor. They don't have to be the lonely neighbor. The shut-in neighbor just kind of like keeps to themselves. So shut-ins are a great opportunity to kind of add that mystery aspect. Like, ooh, I've never seen this man IRL. Those are 10 types of neighbors, 10 stereotypes of neighbors, whatever you want to call it. And thank y'all so much for watching. Please let me know down in the comment section below what kind of neighbor you think you are. I'm definitely like the shut-in, grumpy, nosy neighbor. We love her. But no, let me know down in the comment section what kind of neighbor you are based on these stereotypes. Anyway, thank y'all so much for watching. Thanks for subscribing, liking, commenting on my videos. It means so much to me. And as always, let's get writing.